Hi everyone, how are we all doing today?
Tired.
All right. So once again, I welcome you all honorably to today's session. So today will just be another episode in our database version. So in our last episode, we deep dived into the conceptual framework of database. So we are able to review what database is essentially. So we checked the types. And we also appreciated um, the expectations from a database. So with that, we are able to understand what the ACID and CRUD are in regarding or relating to database. And also we extended into basic operations of database. And we also appreciated what data types are. So regarding MySQL particularly, right? So which is a relational database. So we also ventured deeply into keys, tables, columns, rows, primary key, and foreign key, right? So I would advise if all this still sound familiar, I would recommend you revisit last week's version of this episode, right? So I am very confident everything would make sense because it's more of a foundational knowledge to what we will be building on today. Because today we'll be getting our hands dirty. Basically, we would be working with databases. So we'll be practicing MySQL. So we would be querying MySQL, particularly using Python, right? So being Python engineers. So we wouldn't rely greatly or independently or dependently on the MySQL bench, right? So we won't be workbench, so we won't be overtly reliant on it. So as Python engineers, we should be able to work around the interface of MySQL workbench, even on our Python console or terminal. So with this being said, without further ado, so I will be sharing today's section overview with us all. So we have Robert just joining. Welcome, Robert. So here is our lookup for today. 1 second, please. So in today's session, we would be having a review or revised session on installing MySQL. It wouldn't be a deep dive, right? So it would just be a walk around or a walkthrough, a brief walkthrough on how to install MySQL. So upon successful installation, how can we integrate this with MySQL database? Because this creates issues many a time for individuals trying to incorporate MySQL with Python. So we are going to also do a brief review of this. Then afterward, we would be venturing into establishing connection into MySQL, and then how to automate database to undo error while we are trying to create one. So if it doesn't exist, so you want our automation script to be able to create it. And if it exists, it should give us an output or a feedback, right? To signal its existence. So we are going to check how we can do that, so that this in effect allows us to build a scalable and a giant program, right? Because without that, once a query suspects a database existence, right, it could crash that program. So returning an error, so a very long list error, indicating its inability or inefficiency to create that database due to its existence, right? So, and we don't want this to happen to our program as engineers. So we are going to also review that in detail. So after that, we'll be checking how to create tables. So as we know, we rely greatly on these tables, right? So to store our data. So we all know data are very vital to developers, right? And we want all of this to be stored in a container or in a safe place whereby we can always query. So to perform our code operations if need be, right? So we'll be learning how to do that, how to list our tables, how to also store, how do we populate data into our tables. So these are what we all interact with every day, right? So while we engage with our software application, so while trying to create a post in a social application, so where does that data go, right? So what was the engineer behind it? So what is happening in the background, right? So we are going to be checking all of those also today. So then after that, okay, fine, we've created our database. So we have a table, right, to store the data, to store the information. So when we need them, right, so how do we read from them? How do we update? How do we delete, right, for data that are no more needed? So we would be covering all of this in today's session. So having said this, we would be checking the first theme on this list, so which would just be a basic intro on how to install MySQL, because everything we want to do, we would be relying on MySQL server, right? Because it gives us an ability to have a data structure, right? Because without it, there is nothing we can do. We can't rely on the likes of lists, which we are familiar with, or dictionary. So all of those exits or lost the data we store in them, immediately we end the program. So they don't store a data for a long time, right? So it's just temporary storage, right? Just to check or run a test or just to practice a program. So how do we now store a program for a very long period, right? So, or a permanent storage. So we need MySQL server. So I need to download that. So you can go to mysql.com/downloads/installer, right? So if you've not done that, so you can check that in the browser. So going to mysql.com/installer/what? /downloader/installer. So I think I have it somewhere here. Okay, so as you can see it here. So once you are here, right? Let's see my SQL, my sql.com/download/installer. So once you are here, right? Um, there are actually two versions. So there's a web version and there is an offline version. So it's recommended you want to consider the offline version here. So once you download, just follow basically the prompts, right? So you might want to make some changes if you know what you are doing, but if otherwise, just follow the prompt. But one thing that is equally important while going through the installation prompt is you would have an option that would be the first or second interface. So giving you options, so you might want to select full there. Other than that, so the other things, just follow the prompt. So and when you get to where to input your password, right? So you just enter your password, and that your password will be what you'll be using to create or establish connection while trying to integrate with Python. So I wouldn't be going through this because I already downloaded it and to save us time, right? So there could be most likely a specialized video on it demonstrating how to do this. So now let's assume we've downloaded our SQL. So we now have a data, like a data architecture server, right? So which we can rely on to store our information, right? So in that scope, then as Python engineers, we still can't rely completely on this is what the SQL server looks like, right? So you can do many things here. You can create a table, you can populate data into it, you can perform basically all code operations here, right? So, but as Python engineers, so we would like to establish a communication from a terminal, right? So, and we can do that very simply by doing what? By trying to install the MySQL connector. So this is what connects MySQL with Python. So what you are doing here basically is just to establish that connection between MySQL server and Python on your local machine, right? So that your local machine and Python can understand. This is what I would like to emphasize on this. So that we can know what we are doing while running all of these commands. So what this is doing is, let me use a basic SQL as an example. So in this case, you might want to say select asterisk from, you specify this location, right? Could be a database, could be a table. Without running this connection, Python would not understand this language. It's a language, right? Python will not understand. All of these are language. Python is a language. MySQL is also a language. So all these language programming are programming languages. So they have their own specific, they have the ways, like variant ways of communication. So it is just very similar to we human being, right? So Nigerians as a case study. So we have Yoruba, Igbo, and Hausa. So without learning how to speak Hausa, right? So it will be very difficult to assimilate when in their midst. So it's the same thing as what we are doing here. Without this connection, it will be very difficult to exchange communication between MySQL and Python. So that is why it is essential and primary to also do this. So I've done this before, right? So, but I'll be running it again. So once I run it here, so we can see the outcome. So confirming that this is being installed previously. If it was not installed previously, to just take a moment to download all the packages, right? So what we are doing basically is just like downloading a package, right? So that's what we are doing. So and when that completes, so you are what? You are very good to go. Then you can start using the server, right? You can start communicating with your server, so without hassle. So having said this, then, okay, now how do we communicate with SQL Server, right? Using Python, right? So we have established the connection, right? So how do we now authenticate or authorize Python, or how do we authorize an access for Python into the SQL Server? I would put this again. So now it's just like an access management system, right? Access management system or technique. So you need to do that. It's very important. It is very primary, right? Because it is different from you just coming to an interface, right? And just saying, 1 second. So I'm just saying you want to just start running SQLs. So we call SQL commands. So I'll be using it fondly. SQL. If I say SQL, so I mean the SQL commands, right? Or the SQL operations. So and in this case, MySQL. So this MySQL now, you can't just come into Python and just start using its properties, right? So you must first request for a permission. So it is that permission that will now open door for you, right? To now start using it as if you are what? You are the owner of that house or of the room. So that is what you are doing first. But before then, you need to what? You need to meet up the requirement, the requisites, before it now allows you, before you are welcome into his what? Into his apartment. So how do we do this? So we'll be doing this in a moment. So let me just create a file we'll be working with today. So let me create that very quickly. So the scope of our session today, so we would also be creating a database, right, to store book, right? So a database, we would assume we are building a program for library management system, right? So then we want to store our customers' information, right? So that when we know the books that are going out of the library and the one that are coming into the library, right? So we want to be able to track this seamlessly. So I'll be calling this my bookstore.py, right? So when I save this, um, so when I save this, so as said earlier, right, the first thing we want to do is to what? To request for permission, right? So and to request for permission, we need to import the MySQL standard library, right? We need to import the MySQL standard library. So that's why we now say import MySQL, right? Dot connector. Can we see? We say what? Import MySQL dot what? Dot connector. One second. Import MySQL dot connector. Okay, so one second, please. So let me see if we can work with another program if VS Code will be giving us issue. So let me try and open it again. Let me try and open it again. Okay, so I think it's one moment. Okay, so I think it's accepting it now, right? So this is the first thing we want to do, right? So we want to import my SQL, then with connector. So I wouldn't be delving into all of this because we've done it in our past episodes, right? So what we are doing is just like a method, right? Connecting to a method. So more of a class, this OOP, right? An object connecting to a method of a class. So that's what we are doing here. So connector is like a method in what MySQL class, right? So we need to establish that connection so that it can allow us to start using its commands. So now this connection also now requires us to now state who we are. It's just like an access, a grant access into let's say a venue, or into let's say like um an application, right? So let's say, for example, now you want to sign in or you want to access your LinkedIn account. Expectedly, you are to use your words to sign in using your username and your password. So if you also have second factor authentication should also be requested for you before you are allowed in, right? So that is what we'll be doing here. So that is what this thing is all about. So that we can now do this, we'll now be storing this in a variable, right? So that we can always reference this variable later while working with this SQL. So you can call this variable, so you can just say my DB, right? To put it simply. So so when we say my DB, so a second. So when we say my DB, right? So you can say my DB is equal to what? My, don't forget what we are doing is we are still in MySQL connection, but we want to store all this authentication or authorization inside the my DB variable. You can call it anything. it is not a convention. It is not compulsory you name it MyDB. It could be anything. It could be connection. It could be establishment. It can be anything, right? Just choose anything you know you can always reference as an identifier anytime you want to reference the connection. So that is what we are doing. So you can say MySQL, right? Dot connector, right? So when you now say this, you now connect to another method, which is what? Connect. Then we open a what? A parenthesis. So now we want to start now. So the first thing we are going to do is to tell MySQL where we are accessing from. Are we accessing its server from our local machine, or we are accessing the server remotely, right? So remotely is, okay, what if you want to access MySQL on another machine that is not where the server is installed, right? So you now say host. Host is the machine, like what? The machine housing you at that moment. So since my SQL server is on this local machine I am working on, so I'll just say what? Local host. That is it. That is it. So this is the server, right? Like a powerhouse, an architecture, right? So we are not telling it that, okay, fine, I am accessing this on the same landscape that you are what? Being deployed. Do you get the idea? So that is what we stated here, that, okay, fine, I am still trying to access this from a local host. So then another thing it also now require is what? Okay, user. Okay, I could say this is an establishment, right? A deployment. So in this deployment, okay, fine. As a database structure, there could be several users having access into the database, right? It's possible, right? So now I want to know the user that is trying to access me at this instance. That's where you now state that, okay, fine. Now it is user. Okay, fine. If it is root, in this case, I will be using root. So root is like a default user that has been created for you when you deploy the server. So you can just say root, right? So it could be anything. So you can also create like an additional users, right? So if you want also to grant another developer an access into your database. So after that, it is not enough, right? For security measure. So you also now say, okay, my password is, right? So this is not recommended, right? But just for learning purpose. So I'll just say this, right? So okay, this is my password, right? 1234, right? So this is what MySQL, this is what my Python is trying to communicate into my SQL. So my SQL would now check to verify if all these credentials are correct, then it authorizes Python into its what? Database, right? So no more, no less. That is what we are doing here. So that is what all these lines mean. And it is very important if you are accessing MySQL from what? Python. So as we stated here, so integrating MySQL into what? Python. So we've done the integration. Now you want to access it. So this is it. What is happening here? Okay, so I think it's expecting comma somewhere. 1 second. So there should be comma after all of this. So that I want to believe that is what it's flagging. Okay, yeah, that's it. So, right, so we are good now. So now after we have established this connection, so we might now want to check, right, if our connection succeeds or otherwise. So we might want to check if our connection succeeds or otherwise. So because if I just run this, right, so most likely if it's connected, it might not return anything, right? So it might not return anything. Can we see? It didn't return like a human readable output. So I am still unsure. I could assume, because I am familiar with it, that the connection was successful, right? But it is not a recommended approach to trust if a connection went successfully or failed, right? So we might want to have something like, okay, fine, I want to know, I want to have a server info, right? So that when I run this, when I add this to my script, it can give me an information if my connection is successful or otherwise. So you can just do this, right? So you can say my DB. So my DB is, don't forget, I said it's that the essence of my DB variable we defined earlier is to always reference it, which is the essence or one of the functionalities of a variable, right? So that it can just serve as identifier. So now I need every credential that I have used to establish my connection now. So you don't expect me to now be typing everything again. So that I will just invoke my DB variable, which is stored inside. Then there is a method for it to now get your server info, right? So I can just say get underscore server underscore info, right? So when I said this, right, so it's a method. So don't forget one of our method conventions. So to always end it with a parenthesis. So now if I now run this, so now let me see what happens. So can we see something? We see anything that happened? So we have like something like a version of our servers, of our SQL, MySQL server, MySQL server. So we have like something like 8.0.43. With this, I am confident that I am connected, because if I was not connected, I shouldn't get this feedback. I should get something like an error, right? So indicating either authentication issue, authorization issue, it could be first factor authentication, which is username and password. It could be second factor, it could be multi-factor, it could be anything, right? But now it is established that I am connected successfully, right? So I think we are good with this. So now we can now say, okay, fine, since I am connected, okay, fine, I want to now start using this database architecture, right? So what do you want to do with it? So you can now do anything basically from here. But before you do anything, right? Before you do anything, so the first thing you also want to check is you can't start running any SQL at this instance, even after you've created or established collection. So there is still something that must be it's like a compliance policy. You must be compliant with it, otherwise it will fail, which is what working with cursor. So cursor is just like we now coming into, let's say for example, I am into this workbench, right? So you can see my cursor moving around, right? So when I click on this, if I click on this one now and I type something, now you see, I will use my cursor to go to navigate to the command, the execution I want to perform, right? So that is what this cursor is doing. So now, since we are now on a console, on a terminal, so you want to replicate the same thing, right? You want to replicate the same thing so that we can now start using it as if we were on the MySQL server. That is what that cursor is, right? So, and it's very easy to do. So you just say what? So it is also, this one is also, you are also going to store this in a variable. So, and you can name this variable anything. In my case, I will be naming it cursor, right? So when I call this a cursor, then what am I storing inside the cursor variable, right? So that is where we want to build this establishment. Then I can now store my connection, which is my DB, right? My DB dot, then we say cursor. Does it make sense? So we now say what? My DB dot cursor. So what we are saying is, okay, fine, going forward, right? Subsequently, I can now, I now feel at home in my SQL edifice or in its what home. So I can now go to any room I want to do anything I want. So having this in place, we can now start what? Doing anything we want to do with my SQL. So now in our own case, we have a project we'll be working on, right? So and that project is, as I have said, we want to like create something like a bookstore, right? So this will be similar to what we are familiar with. So let's say, for example, I'll still cite, okay, let me cite an e-commerce, an e-commerce website as a case study here. So for an e-commerce website, right? So we would all be familiar with how we navigate around on these platforms, right? So when we see an item of our interest, we click on that item, right? So when we click on that item, what happens? What has been engineered in the background to go and keep that item where it is being stored, which we all known popularly as what cart, right? So you can go and check the cart and you can find all your saved items, right? So now, in a case whereby you feel you don't need an item anymore, you want to remove it from a cart, right? So that is also another thing, another operation of MySQL, of a database. So we have covered all of this. This is why I wouldn't be going deep dive in what MySQL can do or what MySQL cannot do. So we took our time to explore this in our last session. So now we are just like practicing and having a base, a foundation, a basis of how all of this are being what programmed. So now in our own case now, so we just want to have like a database, right? So this database, we can use it to store um informations or datas or records. So since we are building something for our library management system, so we can say, okay, fine, expectedly, one of the records you would expect, one of the tables you would expect is having like a table that will store customers' information. So which is the same thing as the e-commerce website I referenced earlier. So as a customer of an e-commerce platform, right? All your data, since as soon as you take up your phone and you register, you sign up for that e-commerce, right? So to become their customer, your information is stored somewhere, right? So that table where your information is stored, so it could be called anything. So in our own case, we will be calling it customer, like a customer table. So which means in this customer table, don't forget, in our last session, I said that why it is relational is because we wouldn't be having all the records compressed in a single storage system. So we want to have records that are unique, stored uniquely. Then if there is a need to now build connection, we now build connection, which makes it relational. So that is where um, using foreign key and primary key, right, comes to play. We are going to see this in action in the course of this session, right? So now we are creating a table to store our customers' information. So, okay, fine. We also want to have a record storage for our books. Books are primary or nature to a library, right? So we want to have another storage where we'll just be using to store our books. So we would also be having another like table. So in this case, a storage, right? So to store our author's information, right? So okay, this is just what for authors. Okay, fine. We just want to be storing what authors information in this one. So we'll be doing all of those in a moment. So now, how do we do this? Right? How do we do this? The first thing we need to do is to first create a database. Right? The first thing we need to do is to first create a database. It is now a database that would house our tables. Database is like it's like a structure, right? It's like a structure. So let's say a house, right? House. So in this house, we now have variant rooms, right? So these rooms are now tables where we can keep records. So, and without a structure, there wouldn't be a room. That is why it is primary, and it is like a requisite to storing or creating a table. That is why we need to do it first. So as I now emphasized while introducing our session overview, that we want to build a structure that can run on automation. So how does it run on automation? It could be that in a case whereby a table we are trying to create already exists, right? So our program shouldn't crash. We should have a friendly report that tells us that, fine, this thing you are trying to do already exists. Then we know we don't need to create it anymore. We now move to the next item on our backlog, right? And if it doesn't exist, then we want you to create it by default for us, right? So we now want to undo this. It is what we want to do now is error handling. So I would want to draw our attention back to some of our past episodes, right? So where we also reviewed error handlings in Python, right? So this is where, as developers, right? So we should also, like, we should expect the worst case scenario. So there is something called in technology, right? In technology, there is something called zero trust. So this zero trust policy is, you don't say um I am confident it wouldn't happen. You expect the worst, right? So in this case, we now want to believe that a case would come, or a situation will come, whereby while we are creating this database, it would we would have it already, and if we don't manage it, it can damage or destroy our program, right? So that is what we'd be doing now. Essentially, without that, it is very easy. Without that, it's very easy. So it's something you can just say, since we have established our connection, right? So you can just say this is how it will be, right? You can just say cursor is equal to cursor is equal to cursor equal to, right? Sorry, cursor dot execute. So we use execute. That's the keyword, execute. So now with execute now, we can now be using any command we are familiar with inside MySQL bench, workbench. With this now, anything you are familiar with inside MySQL workbench, you can be using it here. Every SQL. In MySQL workbench, you want to create a database, you just say what create. So it's also a convention to use all MySQL keywords with uppercase. It's a convention, right? It's also it doesn't fail if you use lower, but by convention, we are required to use what upper. So now, since we are creating a database, we can just say what create database, right? So there's also um, an additional keywords to this. So which could be if it does not exist, right? But in this case, you'll be skipping that, right? So you can say what create database, then your database name. So in this case, we are creating a bookstore database. Don't forget, a bookstore database. That's what we are creating. So this is fine. This suffices everything we need, right? This suffices everything we need. But what if that what if is very important? That what if is very important. What if this database already exists? You are not designing your program for yourself. You are designing for end users. You will not be there when all these bugs would be affecting or impacting your users experience. That is why you need to manage them. So this is what we now want to do here, right? So now this would now reintroduce us back to our try and accept blocks of error handling that we've done previously in our Python lessons, right? So, and this would also be an avenue to reintroduce the topic, right? So I'll just go briefly on it. So what does try accept block does or do? So essentially, it's just to while we are expecting the worst case scenario of how our program would be. So it is not necessarily how beautifully you have scripted. Anything can happen. So the first expectation is, okay, fine. A program you expect that would run successfully, you want to put it under the try block, right? So, okay, fine. I expect it to work successfully. I expect it not to return any error. I expect it not to crash. So it should be under try what block. However, so the one you are trying, you are unsure of all the expectation that could happen, that worst case scenario that could what happen to your program. That is what you want to put in your what in your except block. So now in this case, what we want to do is fine. We want to say that if this program, if this database we are trying to create already exists, just tell us that database already what exists. And if otherwise, right? If otherwise, just go ahead and create it, right? Just go ahead and what and create it. That is what we are doing. So we now go back to, so another thing we also need to do is, since we are working with error management, so there is also a module or a library in MySQL, right, that we also need to import. Also need to import a module. So this module we are importing is responsible for this error handling for anything relating MySQL. So it is not far-fetched. So we just say we are still importing it from or inside MySQL connector. Right? So just say from MySQL. So all these are just module, so which I believe we are all familiar with. So MySQL connector, right? From MySQL connector, imports. So what are we importing? We want to import error. Does it make sense? So from my SQL connector, from my SQL dot connector, we want to import what? Error. So now we are good with this. Now I will now go back to this line, which is line 4. So I don't need to rewrite all of this again since it is already written. So I'll now put this under or inside my what? My try block, right? What I'm saying is try this. So try to connect. And if the connection is successful, right, and you connect into this database, right? So if you found this database, right, so just say that this database exists. But if you do not, if the connection failed, then if when you search, you couldn't find that translates that the database does not exist, then create it. So that is what we are communicating now. So let me just deal with this indentation, right? I have to deal with this indentation since we are making some modification. So I am happy to take question in the course of this session. So if you have any question, please let me know. So probably you're confused or you want to ask anything, I'm happy to take anything. So while I'm explaining, so you can, if you've been identifying probably in the in the chat box, if I'm unaware of it, you might want to unmute and speak. So now that we've done this, right? So we say, okay, try this. So when you try this, right? So then now do what? Okay, you also want to indent this one also, the closing parenthesis. Okay, fine. So you also want to indent the closing parenthesis. So since we've done this also, so yeah, we can now say what? We can now say if my DB, which is my database, right? If my DB is, this is the method that checks if connection is successful or otherwise. So in case you are having issues with connection also, so this is like a go-to to also check if you are connected successfully to your database or it's failing. So you can just say something like, if my DB dot is connection, then print this, else print this, right? So it returns as what, as it returns necessarily, so as required. So if my DB is underscore connected, right? So what should happen? So we want it to just print and tell us that what database. So don't forget, this is just our normal print statement. So database, then we now state the database we are trying to create, right? So we want to specify the database we are trying to create so that we can write a neat program, right? So that we can write a neat program. So in this case, we can predefine the database name so that we don't type every time database, sorry. So that in this case, we are creating a bookstore database, right? So every time we don't just create, we don't just type repeatedly bookstore, bookstore. So we can always use the database variable as an identifier, referencing it using string formatter. So in this case, I'll just say db name is equal to what? So let's call it bookstore. All right, let's say bookstore. Okay, so we are calling it what? Bookstore. So in this case, so anytime we just need it, we need to now use our f string here, right? So we can now reference it here, saying you putting it inside a curly bracket. So then using db name, right? So we want it to be in quotes so that we can see something like database, the database name already exists. Does it make sense? So you can say database, then the database name already exists. So that is what we are doing here basically. So then after this, right? After this, what if the database does not exist? What should now happen? What should now happen? So that is when we now want to state that. So now since we are now working with database now, so we might also want to state a database here, but we'll be checking that later. So now let's now assume the database, we don't have it in our MySQL server. So we now want to, this is where we now want to write the scripts that would handle the error. I would like us to pay a very close attention here because there will be new scripting that I will be introducing, right? In relation to how to handle this error brilliantly, right? So now don't forget, the next thing is now except. So do you see? So now say except, then my SQL. So you can say here, except my SQL. So we connect back to that module, except my SQL, right? Dot connector dot error as can be as anything. So what this as mean is, okay, fine. Let me explain this. So as you can recall, we imported from MySQL connector an error, right? So now what this error does is this is the error. This is what if you've experienced an error output working with MySQL before, this module or this library is responsible for it. So it is what is responsible for returning error if you are not compliant with SQL, with anything regarding or relating to SQL. So now we now want to say that, okay, fine. Even if you encounter any error, we want to we want to um we want to store this error inside this variable. So this E is a variable, right? So we want to store it inside this E variable. So it is just like piping, right? So we want to collect that error somewhere and keep it somewhere. That is what we are doing here. So that is what this line translates. Except, okay, fine. What if this database does not exist? Okay, fine. Oh, okay, do this. If you encounter any error, okay, capture the error and keep it inside the E variable. So we now use another if statement, right? So we want to use another if statement now. So this if statement now, so I want to explain something here. So in this error, right? So when you run a program that fails or that doesn't meet this criteria of what we are trying to do, so it returns like an error. And part of the message it returns is what? Is something known as what? Unknown database. So if, for instance, you are trying to connect to a database that you don't have in your server, you would most times get that error. That error is always, it always comes with unknown database. So now you now want to leverage on that text, that unknown database. So which means once we are connecting into this database, so we need to specify the database, right? So you can say what? Database. So then let's establish that also now. So this is also a parameter, right? So we don't have this database, right? So and we want to connect into it. So we don't have, already we don't have bookstore, right? It's just like you going to a bank and you want to go and withdraw cash. And you know yourself that you don't have what? You don't have a dime in your account, right? So what happens? It's just like relating with our bank application. So if you have zero accounts, you are trying to withdraw or you are trying to transfer. So you get what? Insufficient fund as a what? As a feedback, right? So now in this case also, we don't have any database known as bookstore, right? Then we are now saying that if it exists, just print it out that it exists. But if it does not exist, right, we know there will be an error. We want you to create it, right? But before you create it, we want to capture that error first. So amongst what we can now use to track is what? The unknown database, right? This phrase, unknown database, always accommodates the error output you get while connecting to a database that does not what exist in your server, right? So now we are now going to say this, that, okay, fine. Once you see that error and inclusive of the error, there is this phrase in it, right? Then if unknown database in where, don't forget that it is this mysql.connector.error that is outputting the error, right? And we are storing it inside the e variable. Now, if you now see inside the e variable, this error containing unknown database, right? So you want to first convert it to a string, then now specify that variable, which is e. If you see anything, when MySQL connector captures the error, stores it inside e variable. If you now check inside that e variable and you see that error, right? The error is too long. We are not interested in that long list. But now check for us if unknown database phrase is inclusive in that long list of error you might have experienced one time or the other relating with MySQL, right? Now, what should happen? Which means when we see this error, it means that that database does not exist. And if it does not exist, what we want to do is to create it. Then we now start to establish our connection again. The thing we did earlier. So we need to establish, we need to log in, we need to authenticate inside our database again, our server again, right? So that we can create this database. So I'll be fast here. So since it's something we've done before, so just say my db dot, so it's still the same thing that we'll be doing, right? My SQL dot connect dot connector dot connect, right? So what should happen? So what we are doing is, so we just do the same thing. Our host should be who? So our host should still be local host, right? Then our what? Our user still a root user. We are using a default user, right? Then our password is still the same, right? So you say what? Then specify our password in this case. So we've now established the connection now. So now after establishing the connection, so what's the next thing we do? Don't forget, we need a what? A cursor to now navigate around inside our what? Server. So we also need to do that also. So we now say cursor. So it's still the same thing. We'll just be repeating here. So we say cursor is now what? Equal to, cursor is equal to my db.cursor, right? So what are we now doing now? Then we now say, don't forget what I said earlier. So we use this cursor to what? To create. That is when we can now use this what? This SQL. So you can now say cursor dot execute, right? So what are we executing in this case? So we are executing it to now create a database. So we can now say here that what? Create data what? Base. So we can also use if not exist, but since we've captured that, so you can skip that. But you might want to use it, right? So for readability. So you can say what? Create database if not exists, right? So we now specify that our database name now. So in this case, we say what? Bookstore. Is it making sense? So we say what? Bookstore now. So now we now want you to print something so that we can know that you have been able to create it successfully. So in this case, you can just say f string database. Then we specify the database, right? So in this case, what did we call it again? We call it what? Don't forget, we have a variable already, which is what? DB name, right? Sorry. So this should be inside the parentheses. So let me find my parentheses, right? So then we state the DB name, DB underscore name, right? So, and don't forget, we want it to be in a quote, right? So we can put it in a quote, right? Then we say DB underscore name, right? Then what else do we want it to say? So you can just say created successfully. Can we see that? So created what? Successfully. So what you are saying is, in essence, is okay, fine. If this database does not exist, instead of you returning an error, so once you just sense that there's an error, inside that error, capture the error, keep it inside e variable. Now look up for unknown database inside the error message. Then you want to make this a string. Then now we now want you to now create it. We now know that, okay, fine, it does not exist. Okay, fine, create for us, right? So that is what we are doing basically. So now we are good. We've been able to establish that. Now, we also need to now say that, you don't forget, in our if statement, we want to also consider other error that are applicable, right? It is not only database. It could be incorrect password. It could be incorrect username. It could be incorrect server name. Now, in this case, just print out that error. Just print out that error that are also what possible you might what you might encounter. So you want to say error, then okay, fine. In this case, you want to say error, then don't forget our variable that is storing the error, the E, we just return it here. Can we see it? So this is our variable storing the what? The error. So we need to return it here in this case, right? So that any other errors that are applicable, be it password issue, be it server issue, be it the user issue, or any other issue. So now you can just print this out. But what we are concerned about is what we are trying to undo now in this regard is we are trying to undo for what? Database creation. So with this, we are good. So the last thing we want to do is we might want to now close our what? Our database. We signed in. You just like want to sign out, right? So that we don't leave it what? Opened, right? So it's just like you signing into your bank application, right? For to strengthening or to reinforce security. Every time you are done with any transaction, you would want to or to sign out, right? So that is what we are also doing here. So now don't forget our try except block. So another thing we learned in our try except block is that there is also a block, which is a finally block. This one, irrespective of anything that happens, it runs, right? It runs regardless. So we now employ it here. to now say, okay, finally, right? Finally, if then my DB, we state it, our database that we signed into, right, in local. So this is just like a script that you just need to be familiar with, right? So it's used to create, to close a connection, right? A running connection. And my DB dot, if it is still connected, right? If it is still connected, right? So we just want you to what? To close it for us. So then we can say what? My DB dot close. My DB dot close. Does it make sense? So we don't need this for now. So we would want to comment this or just remove it outrightly here. So with this, we've been able to what? To write a program that manages or handles error or to automate database creation. That is just what we just did here, right? So just do this to what? Automate data creation. So anytime we are running this, so any database name we specify here. So you can just come here or reference it anywhere. So maybe you want to create another one, right? So once you just specify it here, right? So if that does not exist before now, it creates a new one. And if it exists, so once it establishes connection, so it's what int us so that we can know. So that is that on that. So now we are now going to test this to know if it is working or what or otherwise. So let me run it. So let's see what we have here. So we want to believe we don't have this database already created, right? So let's run it and see what we have. Okay, we have an issue. So he said 1, 2, 3, 4, a comma. Okay, I think while I was establishing the other connection, I left out a comma. Okay, yeah. There's supposed to be a comma, yes. Okay, it was because I added the database variable afterward. So there's supposed to be a comma here, right? So you put a comma here. So I am thinking I didn't add the commas here also. Okay, so it's already flagged here. So there is a need for commas here, right? To tell the interpreter that, okay, well, this is the end of this line, right? We just continue with the next line. So that is what we are saying here. Okay, so why is it flagging user? Okay, there is no assignment operation. So I skipped equal to here. Okay, um so now I'll be running this again and see what we have here. So we don't have the database. So let's see what we have as an output. Okay, so unsupported argument data. Okay, I wrote this database attribute error. Where is that? Okay, instead of database, I spelled database. So let's say database. Okay, so let's see what we have now. Awesome, awesome. So as you can see here, let me expand this so that we can see it clearly and glaringly. So can you see it here? Our output is what? Database, the bookstore, which we specified, created successfully. Do we see that now? Now let's now check if this handles our what assumption that if it exists, you don't need to create it. Just tell us that it exists. In this case, we now know that it's working fine. Our exception block is working fine. Now we now want to test since it exists now. So now to avoid redundant program, so I will run it again and see what we have. Can you see the output? Database bookstore already what exists. Without this program, right? Without this program, and I'm going to demonstrate that without this program, without this error handling program we just scripted, if we do something like this to crash the program without the error handling, so which we'll be checking later, right? If time permits, we'll be checking this later. So this is fine now, right? So let me run it again and see what we have. So we still have the same output that database bookstore already what exists. Now, I now want to check if this our else block here. We also need to confirm if this else block is working, where we say that, okay, fine, what if any other error, now occurred. It could be any error. So what should happen? So in this case, I want to try a password and see if we have any error here. So I'll just add something to the password, right? So having or trying to use an incorrect password. So I'm running our program and see what we have. So let's see what we have here. So can you see it? Can you see how clean and neat, even when we got error, can you see how clean and neat it is? And it is what? Human readable. That was what we specified here in this our else block. We stated it here that, okay, fine, no. If there is any other error other than this one we are like mostly interested in, when there is other errors, right? We can also capture all of this in other module, right? But now we are writing a script for database error handling. But what if everything is now fine, right? And we encounter another error. So just what? Take that error and print this error. This error we specified there. And don't forget that string, we converted the E to. That is why we are having a human readable format here. So we have what? Error access denied. Don't, you know, I said it before that what we are doing is just for signing in, like authenticating. So can you see access denied for user? So the user at localhost using password. Can you see? So now let's try another thing. So let's say, so in this case, let's say a user that we don't have in our server. So you can just say here, test. Let's just say test and run it. Let's see what we have here also. So can you see, we still have an access denied here because what? Because we are using a wrong user what name. So can we see it here? So that is that on what? On error handling. So if there is any question on this, I'll be glad to answer them before we move to the next team on in this session. So this is fine. You might want to review this for a moment before we proceed. So now what we want to do now is, okay, fine, we now have a database. So as I illustrated earlier, or the analogy I used at the onset of this session, that database is now the what? The house, the structure, the edifice, right? So now inside it is where we would now be storing or putting our records. So on our record, don't forget, relational database, as its name implies, it's a structured database. Structured in the sense that we store values, we store records, right? Using like an organized format. It's like a spreadsheet. We have our column, we have our rows. In our column, we want to state all our customers that we've taken that their data, right? Their first name, their last name, their email address, their phone number, and the likes, right? So all those will be specified in the column. Then we want to fill, columns are what? Filled. Now we want to fill this field or this column with the actual data or record of our customers. So in this case, a customer's first name is so so so, customer last name is so so so, customer email address is so so so. So it is structured, right? So and that's what makes it what? A structured database, right? Other than being relational, it's also structured. So that is why the term table is fondly used while working with MySQL. So now we want to now create table, right? So we want to create table. So this is the table where we'll be storing our records. So I'll be creating a new file we can use for this table creation. So let me do that very quickly. So I just say, let's say table bookstore.py, right? So we can say table book underscore store.py. So we now have a new table, right? So now we want to create a table. So don't forget, anything we do, right, um regarding connection, right? So the first thing we need to do, one of the first things we want to do is to what? to connect into our MySQL server. So to save us time, so I'll just copy all of this since we have it already. So you want to import this, right? So you want to import this and take it to, why is this thing disturbing? Okay, so you want to copy this and just paste it here. So then you also want to copy this connection, right? Just copy all of this, and paste here. You want to paste it here, right? So it's still the same thing we are doing. And don't forget our what? Our cursor, right? So we need it also before we start scripting. So we also want to copy the cursor. So where did I use the cursor? I use it somewhere. Okay, I use it here. So here you want to say cursor, but we need it to this extent. So since we are creating a different SQL, so you can just say this, right? Then, okay, what is happening here? Okay, so now you now want to say cursor dot what? Cursor dot executes, right? Cursor dot execute. So now cursor dot execute. So what are we now doing now? Don't forget, we want to create a what? Want to create a table. So to create a table, so as I have said before, once you have been able to establish this connection, right, and you've identified your cursor, you can start relating with the terminal or the console as though you are inside my SQL Workbench server. So you can use anything you use inside my SQL Workbench server. So now since we want to create this, so this is how I do my own to have a neat program, right? So you want to say, we do this, right? And say that we want to create, we are creating, create table, right? So we want to call our table. Don't forget, we say we are creating which table? We are creating data tables for customers, right? So we are creating tables for we'll be creating table for customer and author and author, customers, and the book, right? So we would have like a storage for book, we would have a storage for customer, and would also have a storage for author, right? So now, as per the syntax, right? So once you say create table, right? So when you say create table, so the next thing you want to state or specify is the what? The table name. So in this case, so the first thing we'll be creating is, okay, let's say the first thing we are creating is author. So let's say author, right? So authors. So since we are creating this table for authors, so you can now say here that don't forget in our previous session, I tried as much as I could to explain the importance of having a primary key in all of your table creation, right? So it is the only identifier that makes or that differentiates one table from the other. So that if you want to now relate or build connection or network these tables, that is what you use in the other table as your foreign key. That is why you want to have like a unique identity in every table you are creating. So it is very important. So in this case, you can just say author table for this, author ID rather. So you can say auto ID. And don't forget, another thing we want to do is we want to state our data type. So we've covered all of this in our last session, right? So you want to say auto ID, and we want to say the data type, and we now want to state that this should be our primary key. So primary key, I was emphasizing on in our last session, right? So this is how you define it. Let me attend to this so that I stop disturbing me. So can we see? So we want to state that our primary key in this authors table is what? The author ID. Then after the author ID, one moment, let me get my keyboard. so that I can add a comma. Okay, so I can move to the next line. So after the author ID, what else do we want to have to make up our um authors table? So we have author ID. So we might also want to have something like author name, right? Might also want to have something like the author name. So I think that is also necessary. So here we can say author name. So author name. So author name. So this is a name. So a name, you want to specify the data type, right? So for data type for author, we use varchar, right? For author. So use varchar. So varchar, you say what? So don't forget, while stating or using any SQL keyword, so by convention, you want it to be in what? In uppercase. So in this case, we say what? Varchar. So this varchar, we now want to specify the required characters. Like, okay, fine. While someone is signing in, right? So as an author, you are trying to sign up. So we, by default, we will create an author ID for you. Then when you want to enter your author name, so this field, the box you are inputting your name, should be able to take up to a specified character. So in this case, we can say 200. So this is what your experience while interacting or engaging an interface that you have like character limits. So when you exhaust a specified, this is where that limit is being specified. Maybe you want to create a post on LinkedIn. So at a point, you just have a character limit. This is where it's being specified that this particular storage can only contain up to this character. So now we are stating that, okay, fine, no, expectedly, name shouldn't be longer than 200 characters. Okay, fine, this should take up to what? Up to 200 characters. So as we have said that, it should be a what? A varchar, since it's a name of an author. So we also want to close this with what? With a comma. So the next thing we want to do is what? So I think this should be fine for author's record, right? So you might just want to need just the author ID and the what? And the author name. So now let's now state, we also want to have another table, right? So this other table will now be for, let's create another table for let's say book, right? So book. So this is where we now introduce foreign keys and how to use foreign keys. Please pay a very close attention here. So I've been introducing foreign keys here. So there is a syntax for foreign keys. So you want to create a book data storage. Then in this book data storage, you would be using the author ID as foreign key. Don't forget, because every book has an author. So we now want to create a connection, a relationship between the database that is storing books and the database that is storing authors record, so that while querying our database, maybe we are querying a book, right? So while querying that book, we might want to now say that who is the author of this book. So that is where our query would now responded with the author name. If we use the author ID or the author name as the what? As the foreign key. Does it make sense? So in this case, we'll be using author ID as the foreign key so that we can use that author ID to track the information of the author that has written the book. So we just do the same thing, right? So we just say cursor again, cursor dot execute, right? Then the same thing as we've done before. I would want to attend to this, right? Doesn't keep wailing. Okay. Nope, nope, nope. So please um 1 second. Pay a very close attention here, please. Okay, so I have my 3 quotes. Then I want to have another 3 quotes here. Then I want to, nope, I don't want to in that line. Okay, let me remove this one first so that I don't have issues with indentation. 1, 2, 3. Okay, this one is even there's a mistake here. It should be 3. Why is it 4? Okay, so we say cursor.execute. Why is it not indenting for us by default? Should indent by default. Let me use my tab. Okay, so since it's not indenting, I'll be using my tab. Okay, so one moment. Why is it not indenting? So let me try that again. Cursor.execute, right? So we can now say, okay, so now you can now say what creates. So basically the same thing, but now we are creating a book table, right? So create table. So I'll be fast now since I believe we have idea of what we are doing now. So create books, right? So in this book, we want to have as our colon. So don't forget everything here they are colons. Everything here are what? They are colons. So everything here. So like the author ID is a colon, author name is also a colon, right? So they are fields. So and so now for books, so we want to have a book ID. Don't forget, you should have a book ID, right? So that book ID should be an integer. So since it will be a number, so specifying it as integer. Then we want it to be our primary key to make this table unique. So that if we want to reference it anywhere, we use the book ID because we can have different books with the same name. That's the idea of primary key. Then we want to add our comma. We want to add our comma, right? We don't need a comma here. So we now want to, the next thing is what? So we also want to have a title for our book, right? So we want to have a title. So as expected to be a property of a book. So we want our title to be like a character. So a character should be up to, let's say 200 also. We've used 200 before, right? So let's just say 150 here. So you can see it can be anything, right? So we want to say 150. Then we should also have what again? We should also have a price, right? So before the price, I now want to introduce a foreign key here. So I want to connect this books table with I want to connect this books table with the authors table, right? So I will now be using the primary key. Don't forget in our authors table, we have author ID as the primary key, right? So in this case, I will now state author ID. Please pay close attention here, please. So I will say author ID, right? And indicate it as an integer. Now, how does interpreter now understand that this is a foreign key? How does it now understand that what this is a foreign key? So there is a convention for that. There is syntax for it. It is in this syntax that you now state it. You now say what? The syntax is foreign, right? Key, right? So you now state it. The what? Author ID, author underscore ID. Then you say what? The next thing is what? References. What are we referencing? We are referencing the author table. You now say authors, right? Then inside a parenthesis, you now mention the what? The colon again, which is author ID. It's as simple as that. It's as what? Simple as that. So what we just done is we've introduced a foreign key. We've established a relationship between the books table and the what? And the authors table by doing this simply. So that is that. So now we want to add more colon. So you can call this colon, let's say, you want to call this colon price. So double. So what double is? Double is also a what? A data type. So it is used, it is similar to floats, right? So if you want to have like a decimal number, right? So we might want to use double, right? So it is similar to float. So it's the same thing as float. So we are not using it, we don't want to use it as an integer. So we are using it as double. So another thing which is expected to be like a property for a book is what? Publication, publication dates, right? So and we want it to be a date. So anything that will be accepted here must be a date. Now, in the previous episode, I mentioned something. I mentioned constraints, right? So what we are doing here is what? This is constraints that we are doing here. All these things we are stating here that it should be virtual or vacal, and it should be 150 characters. It's a constraint. It's like a law or a rule governing our schema. What is our schema? Our schema is a table itself. How we structure, how we define the table is our schema. Inside the schema, we are now what? Also enforcing rules to govern the schema. That this is how we want it, right? So we've been able to what? To establish a what here also? A foreign key relationship here. So we'll create one more table, then we'll be good with table creation. So the last thing we'll be creating is, okay, now we need to now have, since we have a book, we have an author, we also need a customer, right? So we'll now be creating a customer table. So we'll still be using the same thing, cursor.execute. Then we say this. Then we can now say what create table, right? So customers. So this is where we store all our customers' record, right? So since we say this, you can now say, 1 second. So in our customer, so we also want to have a customer ID, right? As expected, as our primary key. Customer ID, sorry, should be an integer and should be our primary key. Okay, so we want to put a comma. So we want to have another thing, which should be what's our other properties of a customer? So another property of a customer is we can say a customer name, right? So customer name. So and our customer name expectedly should be what? A character. Sorry, shouldn't be in parentheses. You want to say varchar, then it should be let's say we want to give it this up to this character, right? So the next thing is we want to also have an email, right? So our customer should also be able to have an email. So the email should also be this in this data type, right? So you're also stating this data type for our email. You'd also take up to 215 characters. So you want to close that with a comma. Then the last one we want to say, address, right? So you want to say address, right? So let's say address. So in this case, address, there's also a data type that we can use for address. So let's say text, it should just be a text, right? It's also a data type, right? So now we are good. We are what? We are good. So now let's review all of this again before we run to check if our syntax is correct or otherwise, right? So we say we want to create 3 tables. So we established our connection. So we also invoke our cursor method using the execute. Then we say create table. We are creating an author table. So in that author table, we specified our colons and we have our constraints using it inside the word schema. So we moved on to the next table we want to create, right? So we just replicated the same thing. So naming this a books table. So we stated the constraints as we want it, right? So we have a primary key, we have title. So in this other table, we now have a foreign key, right? So our foreign key, because we are introducing an author ID that is coming from the authors table here. So we need to specify that, like we need to specify that outrightly as a foreign key. And that's what we did in line 23. We said what foreign key, the author ID, references. So now what is that author ID referencing? It references the authors table as what? As the what? Author ID. Then we have our price, we have our publication date as dates. So we did the same thing for what? For customers. So now having done all of this, so we now want to check, we want to run this SQL and check our what table creation. So I'll be running this now in a moment. So let me clear this first. Okay, so now let me run this and see what we have. Okay, I think, oops. Can you see what happens here? Can you see what happens here? So we have an issue here. The issue is what? When I copied, I didn't change the user what? The user I'm logging in as. So, and don't forget our automation. Can you see why automation is very important? So it is automated now. Can you see? It is what? Automated. It is even working in the back end, affecting or impacting our other programs. So that is what automation is or does. It's in fact affecting what and impacting our other programs. So what I just need to do is just to correct this very quickly and connect with root. So I'll run it again and see what happens. Okay, so we have another issue. So it says syntax to use near publication. You have an error in your check the manual to. Okay, I say publication dates. So what happens? What happens with publication dates? Okay, after double, I didn't add a comma, I guess, and I want to believe this is the issue. Okay, so now let's add that and run it again, and let's see what happens afterward. Okay, so we still have another one. Okay, oops, so we have an issue now because, can you see now? Can you see what happens here? Can you see what happens here? What's happening here? Because of the challenge we had with the syntax, it's already created an authors table, right? And because we do not have any error handling, it crashed our program. As soon as it cited authors table being existed, right? It did not bother to even go ahead and do other instruction. The program just crashed. Can you see it now? So this is one of the key factors of what of error handling, right? So because we did not do anything error handling for tables creation, that if the table has been created already, just do this. If otherwise, do this. It crashed the program and it didn't even bother to continue. So what I will be doing is to be very fast. So I'll just need to go and delete that authors table that is causing this mishap, right? Because since it is created, it will just be saying it and be what and be flagging it. So we have two options here. So I want to believe it stopped, the interpreter stopped here after creating authors. So we have two options here. So let me first check if we can comment this and be able to bypass this so I can just go ahead and create other tables. So let me try this first and see. Fine, fine, that's worked. That's worked, as you can see here. So we didn't get any output because we didn't state that, right? But since we didn't get any error, we can confirm that it was other tables were created successfully, right? So now this will now take us to the next theme of our discourse, which is now that we have created table, don't forget, we are saying that we want to be able to create and to read. So how do we now confirm that all these are tables has been successfully created, right? How do we know that all these are tables have been successfully created? Since we didn't get any error, we are still unsure because we've not seen it. We just created them, right? So that will now be moving us to the next SQL we'll be learning in this section. So which is what? How to read from data. or from table or from a database, right? So how to read from a database. So I'll be using this as a simultaneous um, model to introduce how we can read to know existing databases and how we can also read to know existing tables. So I'll be doing this together in a what? In the same script. So I will be creating another, I'll create another file for it now. So you can use a clean sheet for this. So I'll just name this read data. So let's just say read data, right, for this. So I will be reading data both for our database and um for our table. So for this read data, so I want to say, so I would also be adopting the earlier approach. I'll just be copying all of this, right? So I'll copy up to this place. Then I'll just want to paste it inside this sheet that we just created. Where is the file again? You would want to go away. So what did I name the file? Okay, read data.py, right? So I want to paste it here. So I'll say, let me paste. Okay, it's pasted here, right? So we are doing the same thing, but now we are not creating table, right? We want to read from a table. Now, don't forget, we've done two things. We've done two things. We've created a database, and inside that database, we've created tables. Now, let's now see these tables, right? So, but before we check table, we'll first check database, right? So to now see the databases we have in our what MySQL server. So now to check that, so the next thing, what we just need to do just to say cursor.execute, right? So this is the what? This is the SQL to read or to display a database. So we want to say dot execute. So it's as simple as saying show what database database, right? So you just want to say show database. Now what happens if I run this? I'm just saying show database, show database, show database. Okay, fine. Before I proceed to share with us the expectation or the outcome, I will run it first so that we would appreciate it later. Okay, so what happens here? That's line 1, syntax error. Okay. Yeah, I think I want to say show databases. Okay, so let me run this. I want to say show databases. Okay, I will be running this and let's see what happens again. Okay, so what did we notice here? So let me clear the screen first. So I want to run it again and see what happens. I want to clear. I don't need you. Clear. Clear. Okay, so I'm running it again. Can we see? We didn't get any outputs. Why? Because database is more like a data structure, right? Database is more like a data structure. And for every data structure, before you need to iterate. You know, it's like having multiple elements inside a storage. And for you to access them, you need to iterate over them to fetch them and print them out. But now we have not done that iteration. So you are just running, just sending it and what? An errand. So it's just what? It did not what? Deliver anything for us. So for it to deliver, so you can now say for I anything, as you are all familiar with for loop, right? For iteration. So you can say for I in where? Inside our cursor, don't forget. That is where our database is. Inside the cursor, right? For I in cursor, then we want to print I. So we want to print I now. So let's now see what happens. So can we see, guys? We now have what? An output. In this case, so we have what? So there are some default database, right? If you can see, we didn't create the word database, we didn't create SYS. All these are just system databases that came with the what? The server. But this is the one we created, the bookstore. And while we ran this, we also what? Add it listed. So now very quickly, so that we can confirm this is working. So we'll be creating one more database now. One more database very quickly, so that we would now run this again and see. So I will now change this one to create database, right? So I'll just say create database, then the database name. So you can say example underscore DB, right? So the database name. So I want to run this and see, then, okay, I've run it, right? Then I want to run comment this and now check if we now have this also listed, right? So now let's see what we have now. Oops, what's that? Okay. So this has to be changed. So don't forget, we need to change this to, since we want to display the database, so we need to say show databases. That's very important. So since we are working with SQLs, so this is the command. It's understands for querying databases. So I'll run it again and see what we have. So let me have a clear screen. So let me run this again. So now let's confirm if you now have this new database listed. Can we see it here? So we now have example underscore database also listed. So now we'll do the same thing. Now this will just introduce us briefly to how we can also do the same thing inside our workbench. As I have said before, once you are connected with that cursor, it's the same thing as using anything you can use inside um inside the workbench, right? But this one, you don't need cursor, you don't need anything. You can just say show database is here. So this should be fine. So I will run this one and see what happens. So can we see it here? So this is the what? GUI. This is graphical user interface, but still understand the what? The SQL. So when I ran it, we have what? Database. We have in our database, we now have bookstore, which we created on our CLI. We also have example.db and other system config databases. So can we see it now? So now let's go back to our own console, right? So now we have a database, right? We also have a table. We also have scores of tables. In our own interest, we have the authors table, the books table, and the customers table. Now, how do we now populate information or data inside tables, right? So how do we populate data inside tables? So this will be the next thing will be what reviewing right now. So we want to comment this out for a moment because we don't need it now. So now how do we do that? So we would also be creating a new file for that. So let's call this one recpop, right, .py. So we want to call this one recpop.py. So easy to store, to fill in those columns for what? Now we will now be working with the customers table now. We're working with the customers table. Don't forget we created three. We created author, we created book, we created customer. But now we'll be working with customers table. So we now want to populate information as customers are interacting with our software. So when they got to the field or the box to enter their username, right? So when they enters, where does it go? We are going to do that. We are going to see that now. Or how was it programmed? That is what we want to do right now. So we'll be using the same model, right? So just copy all of these requisites, right? And paste. Then we will now query for data population. Then we come here and paste, right? So we've pasted, right? But now, since we are populating data, so we just say what? We want to say here that now the SQL for that is what? 1 second. The SQL for that is I want to add this one here. Okay. So okay, 1 second. Okay. So okay. So now what we are doing next is what? Populating data inside our what? Our um our what? Our customers table, right? So now how do we do this? How do we do this? So this also, so there is a SQL for what? For for entering record inside a table, right? So what we are doing now is more of creating, right? So you want to create another record inside the table. So now we now use what? Insert. So that is the what? That is the SQL for what? Entering information inside the table. So we say insert into. Now, in this case, what? Customers. So you state the table, right? Then you say values, right? Then a parenthesis, right? So all these are just why I'm doing this, it makes the program neat and readable. You can enter everything in a single line, but you know how cluttered the screen will be, right? So that's why I like recommend this method. So if you know what you are doing, so all of these things you can deal with them, so it should be fine now, right? So now you now want to enter now so this is the SQL, right? Insert into customers values, right? So now don't forget, so we need to be sure of the field of our customer. So what did we state in the customer field? So now let's check. Where is that field? Where is that program we used for creating tables again? So that we can confirm our customers field. Okay, not this. Is it this? Not this. Table book. Okay, yeah, there we go. So now in this our customers table, we stated that we should have the customer ID, the customer name, the email and address, right? So for data, the ID, the email, the name, email and address. So it must come in this format, in this order. Now, don't forget, in our constraints, there is one constraint you would also use most times. So if you want to design a field to not be empty, like it must accept data. So that is an experience when you are trying to fill a form. So you would see some fields with asterisks. That asterisk means it is mandatory that you enter a record here. So a similar approach to that in MySQL is stating why designing your schema using a constraint of not null. So when you use that constraint of not null, it is mandatory for anyone engaging or using that program to provide that data or record. But in our case, we are not doing that. So since we know what we are using as our values, we have customer ID, we have customer name, we have email and address. So let's go back to our rec pop. I think. Okay, fine. So rec pop. So the first one is what? So integer, right? An ID. So in this case, let's just say our ID is 1001. Okay, sorry, since this is the first customer, so you can start with 1000 as the first customer, right? So we say 1000 for the first customer, then we say a comma. So the next one is a what? A name, which we say should be what? An integer. So in this case, we can say our customer's name is so can say our customer's name is okay, Grace, right? So you can say our customer's name is Grace, right? So let's just use first name and last name. So Grace, let me give you a name. Grace what? Grace, can you help me with your other name? So you can move on very quickly.
Uzodima, Uzodima.
Uzodima. Okay. So we have our first customer, right? So now we can now say that um we also close this with a what? With a comma, then we move on. So the next one is what? Email address, I think. So email address. So you can just say our email address is Grace at the company she is working for.com, right? So we want to close this. Then we now say our address. So address is 1234. Um, you want to say 1234 about lane, blah blah blah, anything. So you can just say this, right? So then we can now close this, right? So you can close this. Okay, so sorry, we've closed it already here. So now we have this information for our what? For our user, right? We have this information for um our first customer. So we've entered the information for our first customer. So now we need to run this and see if it works or otherwise. So let me take this back here. Okay, I think it's more readable from here. Okay, so now we'll be running this now. So we are trying to populate data into our database. So let's run it and see what happens. So I think there is an issue. Is there an issue? Okay, okay, it didn't return any error, right? Yeah, it went fine. It went fine. But we can't confirm yet if this works or otherwise, because it didn't return any output. We didn't like have any robust program to state when a new user has been created to display like an output like the account has been successfully created, right? So but since we didn't get an error, we are assuming it is working fine. So now we now want to check our table, right? You want to check our table to be sure that we have this new object, this new customer in our what? In our table. So how do we check? So that is will be now be what? Introducing us to how to what? How to read from a table. So how do we read from a table? So we just do the same thing. We say what? Cursor, right? So we say cursor dot execute again, right? So in this case, we want to comment this out since we've created it already, or we are assuming it's created successfully. So then here, so now the SQL to read from a table is what? We say select, right? Select from, so now in this case, we have two approaches. So don't forget, in our table, we have our fields such as customer ID, customer name, email address, and address, right? Email and address. So email and address, right? Email and what? Email and email and address. We also have email and what? And address. Now the two approaches are you can filter. You can filter your search by field. What do I mean by filter by field is you might just want to only query for your script to display just the customer ID or the name inclusive or email address inclusive or just email address and the name as the case may be, and a host of other options you might want to specify while trying to what to query to read from your what database. But we are going to check both approaches or models. But the first one we'll be checking is because they are both equally important to learn and to know. But it is not every time you'll be needing all the fields to be what displayed or to be retrieved, right? So this is like a retriever measure into our what table. So the first one we'll be checking is we'll be using the SQL to return all the what, all the field, everything in the table. In this case, everything we've stated while what, while defining our table schema for customer. So we can say select from, right? Sorry, we say select, we now state it here, asterisk. This asterisk means what? All. So we should be familiar with this asterisk. We also used it in what? In module and library. Yeah. So like imports, asterisk, blah, 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 to select everything, to return everything. So that is what it does. So we now say select asterisk from where? You need to state it from customer. From customer. Sorry, customers table. So we say from customers, right? So this is it. Now, expectedly, as we've experienced, while we are trying to retrieve table databases earlier, while we ran only this, we didn't get anything displayed because table also, it's a data structure, right? It's a data what structure. So, and everything is stored as elements in that what data, in that data edifice or architecture. And for you to return everything, if you can, if you check, if you review again, see, look at all this information we've provided: name, ID, email, living address or house address. All these things are not single data entry. We have multiple what data entry. And for us to be able to return this multiple data entry, we need to what to iterate. So we still need what to use and what to use a loop, right? So in this case, we'll be saying for I in, so cursor again, then print I, right? So we say print I, so what happens? So now let's see what happens now. Now let's see if we now have the new customer entry in our table or not. So now let's see what happens when we run this. It still did not return anything. Okay, let me see what is missing. Okay, so we say select. Okay, I think on let me review why we are having this. We say should execute this, right? Should to select from, okay, I think we would want to, let's uncomment this for a moment and see. So I'll be running this again from, okay, select everything from customers, right? So, and then we run a query, right? So that query for it to return everything we have there. So now let's see. Awesome. Awesome. So can we see it? So in our table, right, we now have this customer's entry here, which we've been able to display on the screen. So we have the customer ID, we have the customer name, we have the email, and we also have the address. All right. So now let's see what happens if we comment this out and just run only that. So let's see what we have here. Can you see it would not return anything? So because it is a what? It is a like a data structure. So a data structure architecture requires what? For you to loop over, to iterate over, for it to return your what? Your query. So now, what if you have multiple customers record you want to save in your table, right? So how do you do that also? Is there like an approach for you to do that? Is this something we can do, or is it something that is not permitted? Um Gladly, it is what? It is not far-fetched. It's very easy and something we can do. So we'll be using that to also introduce how to populate multiple what data entry into our what? Our table. So what do we do? So here, in case you are doing that, right? So what you just need to do is you don't need to script or write a new query. So you just go to the end of line of the last customer's entry or the record entry. Any entry applicable, you go to the last and you add you insert your comma, right? You insert your comma. So in this case, you inserted our comma, right? Then you now go to the next line and just what? In a parenthesis, you now enter what? The data. So in this case, we can say the ID for the next customer is 1001, right? So 1001 and a comma. So our next customer is going to be, okay, so Ada, right? Ada, please help me with your last name. Very quickly, please. Is she still on this call? Okay, I think she dropped something in the chat. Okay, so Ada Ibekwe. Um, yeah, Clement, to a very large extent. But there will be a recording for you, so you can always revisit. But to a very large extent. So Ibekwe. So we say Ada Ibekwe, right? Then we want to say we want to put a comma, right? So then we want to say our email is ada, let's say just ada.ibk at company.com. So then we want to also state our address. So we can say 25 London Way, right? So let's just have something like this. So we have another data, right? So let's add one or two more data record so and see and understand how this works, right? So we can say this. So you want to add another one. So let's add for okay, we're adding for Lekia Serekara. Lekia Serekara. So I'll be fast with the Lekia Serekara. So it will be his own ID will be 1002, right? So will be his own unique ID. So 1002, his name is Lekia, right? Serekara, right? So then we can say his email address is lek, right? Dot se at company.com, right? Then we can say his address is anything lane something avenue also. So you want to close that also. Then yeah, So let's have one more so that we can have enough record in our what table so that we can have an understanding of how this is populated when we have mass data entry. So we'll be having one also for 1004, 3, okay, 3, right? So 1003, right? So then you can say Clement Ode. So his email address clement@company.com. I forgot my opening quotes, then a comma. Then we want to say his address is also something 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 address, right? So that's his address. So now we have all of this, right? Introducing us how to populate multiple entry inside our table, right? So now we are still going to use the same thing to query the data, the table, right? Or the database in order to retrieve all of this entry for us when we need it. So maybe when this is what we are going to program so that when users need their data, right? So they can have it displayed for them, or even we or us as what as the developer or as the engineers working what as data engineers or developers just working or collecting users information. So we have it now, right? So you can just say in this case everything should be fine. So we are still adopting the first approach. Don't forget I said we'll be checking or looking into two approaches, but we are still what adopting the first approach. So now let's run this. So everything should be fine. So you still want to query to select everything from customers and to iterate the list and display everything for us. So I'm going to clear my screen and run it again and see what we have. So run again. So we have, oops, what's that? Clement is causing issue. Line 4, you have an error, correspond, blah, 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 blah. 54, anything. I want to believe 54, anything. Okay. Yeah, I didn't end the quotes, right? Oh, sorry. Yeah, I didn't end the quotes before a comma. So let me add the comma. Let me see for that potential errors you might want to encounter. I didn't end the quotes here too. Wait, oh. Okay, yeah, I ended this one. So that I won't be seeing this as a new entry. So let me remove the comma. I ended this. Okay, this is also fine. Okay, so I'll be running it again and see. Let's see what we have now. Still have another error. What is this one again? .com. What is with .com? Syntax near .com 54. Clement Ode.
You
Clement
put
at.
at that leg dot set company, you put a quote before the dot com.
Oh. Thank you for pointing that. Yeah. So it was flagging that quote, right? So we are going to be running this again. So let's see. Oh, awesome. So but before the awesome, so I want to clear the screen so that we can have a clean slate. So now let's run it again and see what we have. So as you can see now, can we see? So this is how we retrieve data from a what? From a table. So as simple as that. We just did what? We just say select everything from customers. If we comment out the loop, it would just return an empty report. So it is essential we what iterate what we have in our data structure and return it, right? So now let's see what the behavior is in the GUI, right? So we've just been working with the CLI, right? The console. So let's see what it looks like here. So here, I want to check. I want to check what I have in, sorry. So for the sake of those that are just joining, so I said that also to use this workbench. So instead of having to navigate by invoking the cursor method, so which you would understand when you revisit the video afterward or laterward. So yeah, it just since you are already like at your home, it feels like you can do anything as you want it, right? So you don't have like extra measure you need to comply with before you are what being allowed to access or do anything you want. So in this case, so if you want to check, right, you can just say show. We've created some databases, right? So we want to check those databases. So we just show databases. So all of those long scripts we are writing in the CLI, this one we just return it, right? So as you can see it here, so we created the bookstore and example DB. So now don't forget, we now have data or record inside the bookstore. So we now want to display and have an idea how it looks like here. Now, do we just come here and now say that, now let's see what we queried there. Yeah, don't forget, we say that what? We say that select everything from, before I forget, it's important I also explain the filter method of what? Of displaying a record. So I'll be coming to that in a moment. So, but before then, so I also need to give us an experience of what it looks like here. So can we just say select everything from customers? Let's see what happens if we try that. Select asterisk from customers. Will this work? Will it not work? Let's see. So now when I run, what happens? This is what happens. We didn't get any outputs except an error here stating that no database selected, select the default blah 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 to be used. Why? Because we just come here, like you just want to barge in into a room and go and start packing what you did not store, right? You didn't like even request or you didn't even state that, okay, fine, I am so person, I'm looking for so person. So those person is responsible for so items I am looking for, right? So that's why we need to state that here and say what? Use. So the keyword or the SQL is use. What are we using? We want to use our bookstore database. So we say use bookstore, right? So which means we are saying go inside the bookstore database and retrieve all the customers entry. Now let's run it now and see what we have here. So can we see bookstore? We have customer ID, null, 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 null. Yeah, we don't have anything, but we can we see what we defined, but it didn't return any data. It didn't return any data. Who can guess what happened there? Okay, so what I feel happens here is because here we didn't commit our what? Our data. It is also equally important that we commit. After we've created it, right? So now let's now say we want to save it. So we can say, don't forget we are establishing the connection inside the MyDB variable that we defined in the course of what? In the course of our query. So this is the first thing we did. So we now want to commit everything inside. This is what would now revert back to the what? To the server, to the SQL server, to to now affirmate all the new changes we've made. Right? That okay, fine. these people that are accessing you externally, but they have access, they've been granted, they've been authenticated, they have all the correct credentials, right? So now they want to store this inside their table database, inside their customer's table database. So we need to also say, okay, fine, now commit it. So now let's run it again and now check it again and see what we have. So we've committed, right? So now let's go and see it again. What is happening? Customers primary. Okay, it's flagging duplicate entry. Okay, I don't think we have any issue with this. So just want to check here again and see what we have here. So let's see what happens here. I'll run this again. So can we see it now? Can we see? So this one, it's like human friendly and human readable. So when we now say table, 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 it should now make sense now. Can you see now? It's like a spreadsheet. Now, in our last session, I illustrated and demonstrated this using like a visual representation of what the table would look like. So now, for a quick recap, can we see our column, our field? Can we see it here? Can you see our rows? So can you see how everything is structured, right? We have email address under the email address column, right? So we have addresses, home addresses, also structured, organized, arranged, right? So we also have customer's name, we have customer's ID, right? So this makes it what a structured database. So this is that. That is that. So now, before I forget, what I said I was going to mention is how to also filter um data from your um from your database. So now let's try it here and see what we have. So we can say here, so I can have a graphical display here. So now this is how that works. So since we have a customer ID field, we have customer name field, email and address. So let's say we just need the data or the record of our customer. We just need our customers, just need only the customer's ID. So you cannot say from select customer ID from customers. Don't forget your use bookstores. Once you omit this, or this is not found in your query, it returns an empty list or an error, right? So we need to also say, okay, use bookstores, then select customer ID from customers. So now this time we don't need all the record. We don't need all the data. We just want to know our customer IDs, right? So when we run this, can you see it? So it returns just the what? The customer ID. So this is filtering in work, at work, right? So now let's now add another one. So let's say maybe we want the customer ID um and the what else do you have there? And the let's say email and the email. So let's see what we have again. So can we see? So we also have the customer ID with their what respective email displayed side by side for us. So that is that on how to also what query or retrieve informations from a database. So now we'll be wrapping it up with the last query in our what in while working with what database, specifically MySQL. So and this is what this is how to dispose data. How do we dispose data? Be it database or be it a table, be it database or be it what a table. Okay, so fine. Initially we also we did what? We created two databases, right? So we used one to brainstorm on how to design a robust program that can handle error, provided we give it what? Complete and correct syntax. to track that error and handle it professionally, which we have seen in play. Even unconsciously while we are working, we experienced that practically, right? So now also we created like just an example database. So this example database, we don't need it anymore. We want to dispose it. But before we dispose it, so let's first confirm if we still have it. So you can just say here. So it's the same thing as what we can do here, right? So you can do the same thing in our where is it again? Yeah, you can do the same thing here practically, right? So what we just need to do here is you can just come here and say that we want to comment all of this out. We don't need this one for now. We want to work with database now. So we now appreciate and understand how to walk through and navigate tables. So we've learned or covered everything on table, right? So now a database now. So now let's now display our database again. So you want to check the database we have here. So don't forget the SQL is what show databases. So when we show databases, then we want to iterate over to have a list of our databases. So you want to check that by running this, right? So can we see we have bookstore and example. So these two databases are our own interests. We also have other system config databases. Now I don't need the example database again, right? So I want to dispose it. So how do I do that? So you just come here. So don't forget when we displayed concurrently or just of recent, we have it what listed, but I don't need it again. So I want to dispose. So it is as easy as saying what. So you just come here and use the SQL, which is what drop. Can we see? So you just say drop. What are we dropping? It's a database now. You just say drop database, right? We now state the database name, which is what? Example. Example DB, I believe, or I think. So we want to display, we want to dispose this database example.db. So um, since we are not displaying, we can, for a moment, comment this out and run this SQL. So something should happen in the backend. So as you can see here, so we have something displayed here, nothing displayed, and we didn't get any error. So which translates to it being successful. So then we want to confirm this new change and see if it works or queried as expected. Then we'll be running the SQL to display again. So we say this show databases again, right? So then we want to uncomment this so we can have a full list. Then we want to run it to now see if or if not our needless database has been what displayed. So you want to see that. So as you can see it here, okay, this is not comprehensive. So I want to run it again, right? So let's see what we have. It's still not showing the full list. Is it a full list? So let me just give it some space and run it again. So as you can see here, can we see? Look at it here. So you have bookstore, and initially the example database comes immediately after bookstore, but now we don't have it, right? So let's check it's in the SQL server also. So by just running show databases. So let's see if we still have it or not. So when we run it, can we see? So we don't have example.py anymore, right? So, and that is that for how to dispose a what? A database. So the last thing we'll be checking and then we'll be calling it a wrap is also understanding how we can also dispose a table, right? So how can we also dispose a table? So as we have seen practically how we can dispose a database. So you want to check if it is possible to also dispose a table. So you want to say use, don't forget inside um, our bookstore database, we created how many, let me check that query again. there is one query we've scripted earlier. So let me check again. So to have a recap, so it should be one moment. Bookstore, is it bookstore? Nope. Okay, this is what we used to define, not this. Okay. Yeah, I think this is what I'm looking. No, not this one. Bookstore, table, read data. Okay. Yeah. So if you run this, we are going to see our database, right? So you now want to check, you want to um dispose, you want to dispose a table. So you can say use bookstore since it is inside our bookstore, right? So you want to say use bookstore, use bookstore. Then inside the bookstore, we want to say what? Drop, drop. Now, what are we dropping? Table. So which table are we dropping? Let's just look for one table to drop. So, okay, fine. One moment before we drop. So let's say we want to show the tables first. Show tables. I want to believe. Okay, so we have how many tables here? We have the author table, we have the books table, we have the customers table. So since we don't have any record inside our authors table, so let's just say we want to dispose it. We don't need it anymore. So you can just come here and say what. So it's still the same thing as running it in our what terminal. So once we've established the cursor connection, so you can just come here and say what drop, still the same thing. So just say drop what drop table, then author, drop tables, then what are we dropping? We'll drop authors. Okay, now let's run this. Okay, so we didn't get any outputs. Then we want to see to confirm if this works. So you can just say again, show tables and see what we have now inside our bookstore. Oops, okay, 1 second. So I want to say drop table, then we want to drop authors. Okay, it's returning error. Why? Okay. Okay, so this is because we've established a connection um in this authors table. So it has something like a it has something like a foreign key relationship, right? So this is why we're having this issue. So I would have loved us to test it with the book table, right? Sorry, with the customers table. I don't want us to mess with the data we've populated in it, right? But basically, so once we have been able to run this query, right? So you should be able to also um, delete a table we don't need, as we have referenced in how to what dispose a database that's not what's useful for us anymore. So basically, I want to believe we've been able to cover everything highlighted in today's session. So I'll go through it again to just be sure everything has been justified. Then we can take in questions. Just a second, please. So let me check our list again to be sure everything is covered. Okay, so very quickly for a recap, so we've been able to check how to install MySQL. We integrated Python with SQL. So we also established connection, right? So we built an automation system so that's help us to like build a robust and scalable program so that checks if a database has been created, then give us a feedback by displaying a friendly output to know it is created, and if otherwise, it just creates it. And also, in addition to that, handle other potential errors, right? And give us a very human readable outcome. So we've also been able to check how to create tables, how to list tables, how to populate data into table. So we'll also learn how to read from table, how to post, how to populate more data, like multiple data in a what in a table. So we also check how to dispose table that's are no more what's needed. So with this, I believe everything as highlighted as our what course overview has been what's justified. So in that sense, I will be opening floor for questions. So if there is any question, this is the best time to what to ask. So again, I would like to appreciate you all for staying till this minute. So it's almost 3 hours into today's session. So we'll be taking the question in the background so that this recording doesn't extend unnecessarily. So questions can start dropping in now. Can start asking questions.